TWIA, and it's pretty clear that Congress was trying to constrain the emergency powers of the president in IEPA. So it seems a little inconsistent to say that we have to interpret a statute that was designed to constrain presidential authority, consistent with an understanding that Congress wanted the president to have essentially unlimited authority.
I disagree with that because what Congress actually did as...
What part do you disagree with? I'm sorry.
Well, I disagree with the notion that they were trying to constrain the breadth of the actions the president may take when it comes to this particularly narrow domain, which is, various regulations of transactions.
But how can you disagree with that? I mean, the history is what it is.
Because they made a series of changes to IEPA that relate to the triggering conditions, so to speak, and the procedures that apply, but they did not change the language in IEPA.
Right, but what was the intent of Congress in changing the language? Wasn't it to constrain presidential authority in this area?
To constrain it in the triggering conditions and the procedures that apply in this
those are the triggering context. The triggering conditions and procedures that apply are a means to constrain. That is how they went around about constraining. But my point is that Congress enacted this legislation with the intent of preventing the president from having unlimited powers in this area, and you're asking us to now interpret that statute consistent with an understanding that Congress wanted to allow the president to do pretty much whatever he wanted in this area.
Congress took the language from TWIA and enacted the very same language, and most importantly here, the very same phrase, regulated importation, in IEPA. Therefore, the natural inference is Congress did not intend to change the scope of authority, the powers, the tools the president can exercise.
Did any president under TWIA use that language to impose tariffs?
Well, yes, President Nixon's 1971 tariff.
Not a tariff. That wasn't a tariff. It was a licensing agreement during wartime. It was a specific thing. A tariff I'm talking about.
I'm referring to President Nixon's 1971 tariff.
I'm sorry, excuse me. Yes, I thought you meant Lincoln.
Not only that, but then it was upheld by the Court of Appeals with exclusive jurisdiction under this very phrase.
Can I back you up just a second? I'm sorry. You're talking so quickly.
Sorry.
President Nixon did not rely on TWIA initially to impose the tariffs. Is that correct? I understood that was just a litigating position that he took once it was challenged. That was not his initial.
I wouldn't put it that way because he has a broad invocation. I'm invoking all range of statutes, something like that, in Proclamation 4074. And I think the understanding is he didn't want to kind of spook our allies by invoking the Trading with the Enemies Act, by specifically invoking it, but in litigation it was defended on that ground. So the Department of Justice defended it as an exercise of TWIA and did so successfully.
What's the significance of the Nixon example and precedent here? Because I think figuring that out is real important to deciding this case correctly.
Well, there's one obvious, very powerful takeaway from it, which is that this very two-word phrase, regulate importation, that we say it carries with it the authority to tariff, impose regulatory tariffs at the border, forward-facing tariffs at the border, and we say that's a core application of the phrase regulate importation, had been interpreted 2 years before Congress reenacted that language in IEPA, had been interpreted to carry with it the authority to impose tariffs. So this court said in Algonquin, for example, with respect to President Nixon's...
just back on the Nixon, what was the scope of the Nixon tariffs?
10%, he imposed a 10% tariff kind of across the board to all our major trading partners to address a balance of payments deficit, where he was trying to bring all the major industrial nations to the negotiating table, which he successfully did, but for the imposition of the tariffs, and they negotiated the Smithsonian Agreement in about 5 months, after which he lifted the tariff. So the tariff there was used as here, in part as leverage to get our trading partners to the negotiating table, and it was subsequently upheld by the Federal Circuit, the CCPA, its Federal Circuit's predecessor that had exclusive jurisdiction over that question, to include the power to tariff. And then 2 years later, Congress took that same phrase and reenacted it in IEPA after carefully studying the problem of presidential emergency powers and being deeply concerned about, excessive or abusive exercise of that power. So that whole sort of process gives sort of strong sort of confirmation this phrase, regulated importation, carries with it the power to tariff. Now, of course, that's not our leading argument. Our lead argument on interpretation is there's a pedigree, historical pedigree of regulating imports specifically.
Lead argument, that your lead argument was this long history of the phrase regulate, importate, importation being understood to include tariff authority. So my question is, has there ever been another instance in which a statute has used that language to confer the power?
Well,
putting aside Yoshida.
I mean, obviously, other statutory example is just imports. The cases we rely on are cases where, for example, in Gibbons it's Ogden and Justice Story's
But that
treatise
just shows the word can be used that way. None of those cases talked about it as conferring tariff authority. I understood you to be citing McGoldrick and Gibbons in those cases just to show that it's possible to say that regulating commerce includes the power to tariff.
I think our argument goes a bit further than that as an interpretive matter, because if you look at that history, the history of delegation...
Could you just answer the Justice's question?
Can you identify any statute that used that phrase to confer tariff?
Yeah, the only two statutes I can identify now are TWIA, as interpreted in Yoshida, and then closely related, not regulate importation, but adjust imports in Section 232.
Well, I think adjust imports is differently. So the answer is the contested application in TWIA, and then now in IEPA.
And then, of course, I mean, there's a sort of direct line there.
Yeah, I understand that, but okay.
But then, more fundamentally, we rely on the historical sources to show there's this long historical pedigree of broad delegations of the foreign commerce power, not the power to tax that we're not asserting here, delegations of the foreign commerce power to the president, going back to Gibbons against Ogden, all the way through McGoldrick and Board of Trustees, where this court and founding era sources say the power to, in other words, the power to tariff is kind of this natural, as everyone knows, that includes...
Just ask you one other question about
commerce.
the plain text, General Sauer. So you've referred to the other verbs in IEPA as capacious. Would you really describe them as capacious? Because to me, things like nullify and void have definite meanings. I agree with you that regulate is a broader term, but those words I think are powerful. They pack a punch, but I wouldn't describe them as capacious in the sense that they have a wide range of meanings. So can you describe what you mean by capacious?
Let me put it this way. You look at all 9 verbs together, and you're looking at a spectrum of powers from the most sort of negative, nullify, block, prohibit, void, to the most affirmative, direct, compel, and then also powers in between that are more intermediate,